Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome in our next Eurasia Roundtable by the Eurázsia Center of John von Neumann University. My name is Levente Horváth. I'm the director of the Eurázsia Center. It is nice to be back in the roundtable because for a little time we had some changing in the Eurázsia Center, and now we are doing this roundtable from the John von Neumann University. And the today topics will be the AUKUS, what is actually about the Australia, the US, and the UK cooperation. They have announced a new trilateral program that is perhaps one of the most significant security partnership of this decade. So the AUKUS is focused on building a class of nuclear-propelled submarines, but also aimed at working together in the Indo-Pacific regions, where the rise of China is seen as an increasing threat and developing wider technologies. So the deal marks the first time the US has shared nuclear propulsion technology with an ally apart from the UK. So that's why we have invited three excellent researchers and experts to this Eurázsia Roundtable. And the moderator of the today's discussion will be my colleague, Mr. Csaba Molditz, who is the research director of the Eurázsia Center. And I don't want to waste our time because we just have 1 hour to discuss about this interesting AUKUS stuff. And so I give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Molditz, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just looked out from the window and it is dark and cold outside, but inside I've got here a hot tea, and actually this is typical, but I also have a purring cat next to me, and plus I have this Eurázsia discussion table, so this is the right combination, I guess. So first I would like to present the discussion participants in alphabetical order. So Tamás Baranyai will be one of the discussants, mainly focusing on let's say, on the Western world. He is the deputy director at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Welcome. David Morris, who is Vice Chair, UN Asia Pacific Sustainable Business Network. Welcome, David. And as we usually say, last but not least, Gergely Salát, Senior Researcher, Fellow Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Associate Professor at the Department of Chinese Studies, Pázmány Péter Catholic University. So looking at the topics, so usually we start, so the news about this deal came out in September. And since then, we have had many of these discussions, and many of them starting with the interests of the United States. Some of them focusing on the United Kingdom. Basically, if you look at these three parties, there's basically only one that cannot leave the region, which is part of the region, which is located in the region, and this is Australia. So that's why I would like to start this discussion with Australia. So the basic, very simple question is, to me, is what does the AUKUS mean for Australia? Which seems to have abandoned, at least to me, and you can correct me definitely, these original Australian strategy, taking no sides. Yeah. So what are the costs, or what are the benefits to Australia, both geopolitical and even economic costs and benefits? So what do you think, guys?
Thank you very much, Csaba. And thanks for the invitation to participate in the Eurázsia Forum. And it is rather interesting to be discussing a part of the world that is, of course, not part of Eurasia, but actually in a sense, the geopolitical mirror image of Eurasia, which is this new invention of the Indo-Pacific, a rather new term that has been popularised in Australia for a number of years, because it made a lot of sense in Australia to think about its geostrategic location as being straddling the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. So it's a natural term for Australia. It would also be a natural term for Indonesia, which also straddles both oceans. But what's very interesting about this term is that it's been picked up by the United States and by the wider Western world in recent years, and has almost replaced the former geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geographic descriptor, which of course was Asia Pacific, which tended to be the language that is still used in the United Nations and amongst most of the people of Asia, and including many Australians who would still use the language of Asia Pacific. But yes, I think that's an interesting place to start, because in fact what we see is a reshaping of the geopolitics and an invention of a new region that could be imagined perhaps to encircle Eurasia, in particular to encircle a particularly large actor on the eastern end of Eurasia. Of course, that could be one way of imagining what the Indo-Pacific is, that it's this big arc of countries that span around in a circle from the United States and Japan down to Australia and across to India. And so why do we start to imagine this instead of the traditional Asia Pacific vertical? So we've switched from a vertical way of thinking in Australia to this arc of interests and of geostrategy. For most of my professional life, working in the international relations field or in the field of either diplomacy or international trade and investment promotion or related fields, it was the norm for Australia to see itself as part of this Asia Pacific vertical region, that its interests were largely in its direct north. Its geostrategic interests were in defending 12% of the Earth's surface, and that meant defending Australia from any risk that rise to its north, and that entailed both having a consensus of support for an alliance with the United States, but it also, since the 1970s, had also entailed a very strong consensus support for geoeconomic integration into what today, in 2021, is of course the world's largest economic region, the part of the world that's driving the global economy, which is still known as the Asia Pacific region. And Australia, of course, became very prosperous as a result of this strategy, and safe. Arguably, it had its US alliance and it had its geoeconomic integration into the world's fastest growing region. And this served Australia for decades with changes of government. Both sides of politics supported this strategy, but everything suddenly changed in recent years. And it's very interesting to see how rapidly this changed around the time of the election of Donald Trump, but not necessarily only because of that. I think we were already seeing with Barack Obama's visit to Australia and his announcement of a pivot to Asia, we were already seeing the development of a change in US strategy. And so what that meant for Australia was starting to become a debate a number of years ago. Would Australia need to choose between the US and China? Its economic interests or its strategic interests, could it have both, or did it have to choose? And we heard from the US, we heard from the Obama administration, we heard from the Trump administration that yes, Australia would have to choose the US over China. We heard from the Chinese, and I served in China for a number of years as a multilateral diplomat representing the regional organisation, the Pacific Islands Forum, and I regularly heard from the Chinese a similar argument. Well, you Australians are going to have to choose, and it'll have to be China over the US. And neither of those positions was acceptable to the generations of international strategists from Australia of my generation. But interestingly, in the last few years, there's no doubt that the government of firstly Malcolm Turnbull, which was a very finely balanced government in which Turnbull was under enormous threat from his right wing, and he was in a very weak position. He, there is no doubt, used in domestic politics, used a ramping up of confrontation with China to not only secure his position as leader, although it didn't work because he got ultimately rolled by his right wing, but he also used it to shore up his very shaky relationship with Donald Trump after an extremely tense initial interaction with Trump, in which I think the Australian establishment was quite afraid, as of course across the West there was a fear that Trump was leading the US away from its long-term strategy of alliances. So in the Turnbull government, you saw this turn to reassuring the Americans and to sending actually quite provocative messages to China, starting to ban investments when Australia had been one of the most open economies to foreign investment that had benefited so much from Chinese investment. You saw the banning of Huawei, the first place to do that. You saw a series of events like that. And then you see the replacement of Turnbull by an even further right-wing government, which takes us back in its language to the all the way with the USA type politics of the Vietnam era or of the Iraq War era, where Australia did follow and made sure that it was side by side with the US in the US strategy. So basically Australia has now bandwagoned with US strategy, and US strategy as it started to emerge in the Trump years as looking more and more like containment of China, which of course meant Australia had to make a choice, because you cannot be attached to containment of the country that you want to have a close economic relationship with. So clearly this government in Australia appears to have made this choice, and in a secretly hatched deal with developed initially with the Trump administration, then continued with the Biden administration, now has committed itself to what, quite frankly, is a huge shift in strategy to have what can only be described as probably subcontracting a set of nuclear submarines from the US, because essentially Australia will not have this, it doesn't have this technology or the capability, so it will essentially be reliant upon US or UK technology. And of course it positions itself, unlike the position that it had been building for generations of being very deeply integrated into the Asian region, it positions itself in a way that has created quite some tensions with its neighbours, with Indonesia and other countries that are concerned that this may stimulate some sort of an arms race. Now, two things I'll say, and then I'll wrap up these introductory comments. But very important to look to domestic politics and not to ignore domestic politics, because this is a fragile government. This is a government most commentators, myself included, thought could not win the last election because it's one of the most incompetent governments we've seen in Australia for a long time, for many decades. But it did narrowly win the last election, very narrowly, and it has shifted further and further to the right, as we're seeing, of course, across much of the Western world. And so I wouldn't be making judgments about the long-term direction of these sorts of decisions. This was an announcement that's very much about the optics. It was about the three men standing there with their red, white and blue flags showing how tough they were against China. But is it feasible really for Australia to develop nuclear-powered submarines, and will they even be very useful in 30 or 40 years' time, by which time all the expertise I've read tells us that China would be able to detect such submarines, and if they were operating on the Chinese coast trying to keep Chinese submarines out of the Mariana Trench, well, they'd be pretty vulnerable. Whereas Australia might decide over the next couple of decades that its interests might be in developing much more flexible and less detectable weaponry and hardware that actually it has the industrial capability to develop itself and to be more self-reliant in partnership with the US, but not dependent upon the US. So I wouldn't count on this necessarily happening. I think it's a big announcement that sends a strong message to China, but it's an announcement to look at a possible plan to do some feasibility around something that actually looks very difficult to make work. And secondly, not just the domestic politics of this, but I'd also look at the whole question of the future of regionalism as well, because while this government, which is still, I think, a relatively fragile government and could well lose office in the next few months, while this government has put all of its eggs into one basket and is happy to play a kind of an ethno-nationalist game of positioning itself with the UK and the US in the world, that doesn't represent modern Australia, which is one of the most multicultural societies on earth, and which actually is deeply integrated with the Asian region. And so it may well be that a change of government might see at least a change in the style and operation of how this is positioned. It doesn't mean that Australia won't in the long run perhaps develop some nuclear submarines, but it's much more likely over the coming decades to strengthen its relationships with Indonesia, with ASEAN, with a broader range of partners than just positioning it with the three white guys. It's not a good look for Australia. In fact, it's a very damaging look for Australia, given its geographic position. So I think, lots of questions there about actually what does this all really mean.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David, for this detailed answer. Basically, I wrote here 2 questions to you, but you immediately answered them. So I could make a tick here. So my next concern is definitely China. So what is the reaction? So whether China's reaction can lead to, let's say, to heightened tensions or what? So what can you see there, especially when it comes to the, let's say, the domestic politics part? Yeah. So when it comes to China. So, Gergely, I think that the floor is yours because this is really your table.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think that originally China was not a very active player in this game, but when the mood changed in Australia, somehow it had to react a few years ago. I don't think that China actually wanted the relations between China and Australia to turn so sour as it happened, but it had to give some reaction. And I think that China's leadership is somehow a captive of its own nationalistic propaganda and its all nationalistic public. We think that China is not a democracy and they don't really care about what people think, but actually we know that Chinese leaders are very conscious of what Chinese people, especially urban young people, think, and they tend to be quite patriotic, or we can say nationalistic. And of course, if China gets a blow from some outside force, the leadership cannot back down. They cannot say that, oh, nothing has happened. They have to react in some way. And I think the Chinese reactions to the first Australian steps that maybe said to be anti-China, they were not really well thought of. They were not they were not very well calculated, and this whole thing went down to into a spiral. Like Australia was doing some things that were hostile to China, like banning of Huawei. Then China initiated some embargo on some Australian products, and then Australia reacted and China reacted again. So this whole thing went down into a spiral, and I don't see the end of this spiral. AUKUS is just one part of this spiral. Maybe it's the deepest part of this spiral right now, but it can get even worse. And as far as I can see now, the Chinese political life, and Chinese leaders are quite paralyzed because next year there will be a party congress, and this is not the time when strategic decisions are made, and this is not the time when risky decisions are made. Everybody is playing his or her, mostly his power games at home, and of course no Chinese politician can appear to be weak before a party congress. So everybody who wants to play an important role in the coming years in China want to be seen as a hardliner and nationalistic, as a strong China advocate. So I think the spiraling of the Chinese-Australian relations will go on for some time. And we will see what happens after the party congress. Maybe the partly new leadership, which will have 5 years until the next party congress, maybe they will come up with some new strategy towards Australia and also towards the US. But I think that until now, which is next autumn, things will go into a bad direction. If you think that I mean the souring of Australia-China relations are bad, then things are going into that direction.
I see, but it's very interesting what you both say, because on the one hand, David says that if you look at the domestic politics, there is a chance, maybe slight chance, but maybe this direction will maybe not reversed, but a little bit amended somehow, and having maybe a more peaceful or friendlier tone on China. And what you are also saying that for a while not, but then after that, then there is also a chance. So my question is to Tamás is basically, how do you see this one from a Western point of view, from the point of view of US, obviously, UK, and even Germany, and maybe France can be player somehow. I mean, not part of the agreement, but somehow their opinions might change somehow the picture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this, let's say, comprehensive question. But first I have to refer to something that David said, because you mentioned that Australia has been benefiting from Chinese investments, and it was refreshing to hear this connotation, Chinese investments and opportunity. Now, you know, the general discourse in Europe is Chinese investments are predominantly threats, and obviously they have been beneficial to this region and actually in many places. Obviously, there are threats as well. It was just very fresh to my ears. So thank you. Okay, so going on with the question. So I think from a Western, let's say US point of view, there developed a need for strategy vis-a-vis China. And I think if you want to pinpoint a time when this in fact emerged was in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, but there was a sudden American realization that China rebounded from the crisis like much quicker and in a much healthier way than the Western world did. And finally, there was feeling that China can surpass the United States in some of the economic dimensions that had been ruled before by the Americans. So there was a need for a comprehensive strategy. And actually, the Americans tried to sketch up some kind of strategy. The pivot to Asia was part of this. The very idea, they actually adopted an idea from the region, that is the Indo-Pacific concept, of which they really thought could be a counterweight or an alternative way to describe the region than this Eurasian concept, and they could provide an alternative. I think the problem was that, so once you have this pivoting to Asia, and you have the concept of the Indo-Pacific, you have to translate this into actual policy, and this is the part when they were faltering. And I think AUKUS is just another example of this faltering. Why I say so? Because the Americans always wanted to come up with a holistic idea, idea that ranges from economy through politics, and obviously should have a military dimension as well. But it always turns out that when it comes to this region, they are strong in military, but they provide like no economic alternative to the regional integration that is ongoing, or it is a heavily integrated region, and without putting money in there, without putting incentives in there, there wouldn't be an alternative economic integration model. And honestly, the Americans are lacking the political will to do so. But they are not lacking the political will to ramp up their military commitments around the region now that they found a new adversary, obviously China and its newly found voice in international relations, newly found, how they call it, this assertive foreign policy. I think this is the one thing that lays behind, is beyond the concept of AUKUS. And again, my central idea is that they always want to start out with something holistic, and they end up, on the one hand, with something that is like one-dimensional, like military focused, and the other thing is, let's be honest, they concentrate on their very old friends, like the White Pacific. I mean, okay, New Zealand is like another story, but so sometimes I wonder how Indonesians or other countries from the ASEAN see this alignment of countries who share this political identity of Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Obviously, the country doesn't have to have a Protestant majority or a white majority to have a VASP political identity. But I think in such a region, which has actually always been very hard to crack up for the Americans, because most of the countries are committed to the Panchio, the 5 principles. This is very deeply rooted in Asian politics. So they respect territorial sovereignty. They respect the sanctity of domestic politics. This is, we can say now, this is alien from Western politics today, because Western politics is centered around, for instance, shoring up and supporting and spreading values, human rights, whatever. And this is completely alien from these ranges of countries. So it was very hard to crack up this region to have very meaningful alignments with those countries. So who to turn to? The very old friends and allies whom we share an ethnical and political identity. And I think this is very dangerous in this part of the world, and it doesn't bode well for the endurance of such undertakings. So this is actually how I see it by and large this AUKUS. And I think for the end of my intervention, I think there are a couple of questions of which I don't want to answer to, but I think those are things that were left unanswered, and I think from an American point of view, those things are like suspiciously lacking. First, there is nothing very substantial. We don't have a document of AUKUS. We are actually working from like press releases, and not press release of the fact of, for instance, this submarine deal. We are dealing with the communication of the state leaders who actually met. This is like nothing in the world of international relations. This is political communication, and we don't have more. This is suspiciously lacking. Second, so there will be American submarines, nuclear propelled submarines instead of French ones. Again, this is something that may not be good for the so-called Western Alliance, and also leaving out New Zealand, because it is a country of a very deep anti-nuclear conviction, is also something that narrows down the scope of the so-called Western alliance into something that is more like an Anglo-Saxon, a selective Anglo-Saxon relationship. It might not do good for the whole cause. Third, I am not quite convinced of the defense merits of AUKUS either, because the first nuclear submarines to become operational would be sometime in the 2040s, and there will be a time in the 2030s when Australia would be even more vulnerable than it is today now. So how do you actually address this problem? How to fill this gap? So again, not convincing. And the fourth question is obviously the issue of nuclear proliferation, because here we have a country which previously owned no nuclear weapons, and he is a signatory to the NPT, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of '68, and now this country actually receives nuclear weapons. Okay, that is a very complicated international, this is a question of international law, and it is not precisely receiving nuclear weapons, but it borders on, and actually it might not generate good feelings in the region and maybe beyond the region, because just one example, maybe it would be later picked up by Russia as an example how the Western alliance actually breaching the very rules on which the international order is based. So why wouldn't we? So I think those are three very relevant questions. Actually puts the whole AUKUS concept into a more critical light, and I think I tend to see it in a more critical light. So I think it is coming from, again, Western frustration of their hard times to reach out to the Asian countries, and their frustration to translate the Indo-Pacific concept into something meaningful. And this is what came out of it, and it looks to be serving the purpose, but there are very serious weaknesses to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamás. Before giving the floor to others, only one idea. So what you said, so that the United States does not put money into the region, yeah? You said, I would add that that's true, but partly because American enterprises boldly invest in the region. But the difference is, and this is a big difference, definitely, that the Chinese government easily can influence Chinese enterprises, companies to invest or not to invest. The American government might influence, but definitely the efficiency of this influence or leverage is weaker. And from this point of view, so at least at this point, so we can say that the Chinese, not model, but the Chinese system works better. Maybe only in the short run, we don't know, but it's true. So this is, at the same time, I do agree with you when you say that the American strategy is one-footed, yeah, in contrast to the Chinese strategy. So I would like to give the floor back to David and Gergely, if you would like to react to those what was said before.
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up on a couple of those points about the US, because it seems to me in the Asia Pacific region that even what is called here in Europe the Cold War was not a Cold War. There were hot wars. There were a whole series of them, and so the US as a global power after its victory in the Second World War over Japan, for which Australia was eternally grateful, America learnt the lesson that force is the way to deal with enemies and the way to deal with threats. And the US, as we know, adopted this containment policy of the USSR, but at the same time it fought a series of wars in Asia. And in each of those wars, its most loyal supporter was Australia. And of course, the UK often gave moral support, even though it was not necessarily there in Vietnam, etc. But so throughout the period, I think in that part of the world, it's a different. This is, I think, a really important question in international relations, because international relations thought is often or has traditionally over recent decades been developed essentially in the capitals of the West. And yet actually in the East, the experience of the post-war era was a very different experience. It was an experience of conflicts, all of which the United States did not prevail in. But yet the United States' concept of international relations is that it does prevail as the global power. So it's had a series of defeats, actually, but yet it still retains this confidence in itself that using force is the solution to international problems. And I think this is a very important thing that we ought to all think about when we consider how the US and its loyal deputy in Australia might be considering how to deal with the challenges of a rising China, because of course, naturally, China raises enormous challenges to the US. If the US considers that it must be the global leader, China is passing the US on many measures of power apart from military. And in its direct region, obviously, China has aspirations to have greater power and to have greater reach. There's no doubt about that, and so there's no doubt that that's represented as a threat in the United States. And how you solve that with force alone is the great unknown. Are there people who seriously believe that some sort of conflict with China is winnable? Because what concerns me is that actually, why are we not hearing voices about alternative strategies that might still be based upon overwhelming strength of the West, which all of us from the West would want? A strong West would want, as an Australian, I'd want a strong Australia, strongly defending its part of the world. But do you defend yourself by going on the offense and by provoking and by looking for conflict, or do you invest in actually the kind of security architecture for that region, the norms and rules of operating that might actually stabilise things? And this is where Australia and the US and the UK would have a different perception than other countries of East Asia in particular, who would have the view, as was pointed out, of the principles of the Bandung Conference, of the principles of non-interference, of mutual respect, and all of which is often mocked in the capitals of the West. ASEAN is often mocked as an ineffective regional organisation, but yet, since the end of the so-called Cold War, actually, Southeast Asia has been a region largely of peace. There have been some, of course, crises, internal crises, Myanmar at the moment, but the relationships between countries of the world actually have been relatively stable. And countries such as Indonesia, they perceive, from giant Indonesia to tiny Singapore, they perceive that actually they can best manage China by balancing China and the US. And so this Anglo-American view that we must provoke or confront or contain, not necessarily all of those, by the way, but there are voices representing each of those strands of Anglo-American thinking, can entail some risks. Now, it may be right. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that there isn't sufficient discussion about alternatives which actually other countries in the region are pursuing. There's the alternatives that Australia a few years ago would have been a champion of, building architecture of the region, building deeper integration, and actually balancing between sides instead of taking one side. This debate seems to have disappeared.
So we can say that this is a little bit also about the changing perceptions, yeah? So how these countries see themselves, so how the other ones, for example, a few years ago, when you went to China and you talked to Chinese people, then when they were talking about, let's say, foreign countries, they basically meant the United States and Australia. So what is that? So this question is rather to get. So what do you think, how, because of these growing tensions between United States and China, so the perception of Chinese people changed about Australia obviously, and United States and somehow even United Kingdom.
I have this feeling that China is getting to be more hostile towards American people and, of course, American politicians and also Australia and the traditional Western powers, including Western Europe. But I think this is a reaction. It was not the Chinese who started changing the international mood. I mean, in the traditional system that was built in the past decade was quite comfortable for the Chinese. But when sometime around the beginning of the last decade, the allies in the United States, they realized that China is a challenge. China is a threat to American hegemony. China is not a big Japan. China is China. And first, the mood changed in America, and of course, America has a huge influence on European countries, not only Western European countries, but also Eastern European countries, and of course on Australia and Japan and South Korea. And America puts a great pressure on the politicians of its allies to turn against China, and it also influences media and communication in these countries. For example, in Hungary, you cannot really read any newspaper articles that is friendly toward China because Hungarian journalists are reading only if they speak any foreign language, then they speak English. What they read, they read American newspapers, and they tell stories of China from or through the mirror of the American press, which is quite anti-China. But I think the situation is the same everywhere. And of course, China has to react to it in some ways, and Chinese people have to react to it in some ways. And I think most of the Chinese people feel this whole anti-China sentiment in the West is a loss of face for them, and we know that face is very important for the Chinese. And if an American politician or an Australian politician or whatever politician is saying bad things about China or even Chinese government, then most of the Chinese people feel that this is hurting. This is a loss of face for them, and this changes the mood in China as well. So things are going in a direction both in and outside China that the parties are getting more and more suspicious about each other, and they are clearly getting into an arms race on the military level. And I think those people who are talking about the starting of a new Cold War, who are saying that we are in the initial phase of a new Cold War or Cold War 2.0 or whatever, they are quite right, because these times really resemble the late 1940s, the early 1950s. We are seeing that the two great powers, the leaders of the two camps, are now trying to forge their alliances, to reorganize their alliances. I think the West or the United States has a huge advantage because it has been building its alliance for like 70 years now, and China is not in such a good position. But we can see that China is doing its best to form maybe not a real alliance, but a very close strategic partnership with Russia. We can see that it's trying to gain more influence and leverage in third world countries. So we can see a very similar race to win over countries throughout the world by both the great powers. And as David said, that if there's a Cold War, there might be some hot wars again some proxy wars, and I think China is forced or will be forced to take part in this events, maybe even in these hot wars. Even though right now I don't think China is very happy about getting into a cold war. I don't think it would be very happy to get into a war in Africa or wherever. But I mean, if you are a great power, you just cannot afford to escape from this kind of situation, and China will have to take the gloves and get into the rings and box.
Yeah, I see. So if we broaden a little bit the picture, I guess you remember when the BRI was launched a few years ago, then many analysts tried to explain this one with the following logic, that the China is weak on the sea, and that's why it makes sense to turn to the West, and that's why we have BRI, different versions of BRI. So looking for connections to Central Asia, to Europe, and etc. Do you think that, assuming that the AUKUS is extremely powerful and will be an extremely powerful and successful cooperation, military cooperation, then again it will lead to a new reaction, to a new, let's say, wave of initiatives from the Chinese side to go to the West? Yeah, Tamás, what do you think?
Complicated question. Actually, I think
that's why that's why
that's
I'm
your job.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so I need to reiterate what I said previously. Most of those steps from the American side are emanating from their counter vision of the Indo-Pacific, which I actually consider a counter vision in this form to the Eurasianist outlook of the BRI. So there is obviously this thinking behind coming up with AUKUS. How the Chinese might react is, for me, is shrouded in fog. So I don't know. That it could be logical. However, it's not really up to the Chinese. Like Gergő just mentioned, the steps of alliance building on the side of the Chinese. I actually consider those steps, this best price solutions for something that resembles an alliance, but not quite an alliance. So they have good relations with Pakistan, some countries in the third world countries. But what they would badly need is some sort of regional consolidation of their influence. Is just something that is not in the tube. Again, for regional characteristics, like again the commitment to the Panchil, the Chinese, the tradition of Chinese foreign policy that is again not really focusing on alliance building, and it would be. I mean, it is likely that it will be increasingly difficult to exercise influence throughout Eurasia, because okay, the Chinese may be weak on water, but Eurasia as such is a vast piece of land with many different countries, and in some of those countries there are great Western influence just as well. So I'm a little doubtful about that, but I think David has some counter arguments.
Dare I say it at the Eurasia Forum, but I think this is not all about Eurasia. I think at the end of the day, the shift in the world order that we're seeing, and we're still at the beginning of this shift, but there is a shift to what we used to call in the old days the Asia Pacific. I mean, that is already now the center of the world economy, but there's no doubt in future, if we look forward into the future, unless there are some totally unforeseen events and crises, and of course they can happen, but based on trends that we see today, the Asia Pacific region will be the center of the world economy, and therefore it will be the fulcrum of international power in many respects in the world in the future. And this is an enormous threat to the traditional powers that have dominated the world for the last couple of hundred years. And of course, Australia is a child of those traditional powers in some senses. In certainly in its mentality, it is. It certainly considers itself to be the child, if you like, of the UK and the US. And so this is creating anxiety there, and it's also creating anxiety in Eurasia that this is a big shift. China, I agree, is engaged in a global geo-economic strategy of extending its influence, if you like, whatever that word means. It's certainly extending its economic integration, and that does bring influence, of course, and that will be global because it's a global power as the US is. But the US has a different strategy from a geo-economic strategy. It has been the leading economy in the world, but it will no longer be that. It's shifting into being a secondary economic power, but it is investing still in its overwhelming military geopolitical strategy. So you've got two schools of thought here, which we in the West think is all about geopolitics, but actually from the Chinese perspective, and dare I say it, almost all of Asia, in fact, the focus actually is on geoeconomics. And yes, geopolitics is essential. It's essential to protect your interests, but actually the way of looking at these issues in Asia is a much more geoeconomically centered way of looking at things. And so this means we are, in a sense, in a conversation where we're not understanding each other because we're talking from different perspectives. From the West, we're talking about power, and we therefore talk about Chinese influence. But in China and in much of Asia, they're really talking about prosperity and peace. And of course, that means protecting against threats coming from anywhere, including from China. But it's a different set of priorities.
Okay, Tamás, please.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Yes, I think this brings us to the main question of whether we are facing a new Cold War or not. I know this is a very, very tempting framework, but this is only because this is what we've learned in school. I think the situation is pretty different now. You cannot divide up something to spheres of influence unless your armies are actually meeting at the center. This is what happened to Europe. This is what happened to most of Asia in the wake of the Cold War, just at the end of the war, and that's a whole different situation. We have now a region that is actually quite resistant to become one-sidedly dependent on any outside power. They don't want to choose. Even Australia doesn't want to choose. And I'm not quite convinced that the different layers of this very complex country all support this this political direction, what is now taking shape in Australia. Maybe they do, but I think it's a more complicated question, even in such a country, which is again a more wide country in terms of political identity. This is not true obviously for the region, and also by the time when the real Cold War was actually picking up steam, there was a time when the Soviet Union, which was the engine of the other side of this conflict, had been exercising autarkic economic policy for like 2 decades. They had practically no economic relations apart from the wartime projects of Lend-Lease and stuff like this. They didn't quite have meaningful economic relations with the West. So they could be very gladly wade into a Cold War. The situation is very different now. So we are talking about Cold War, rising international tensions, Taiwan, and other issues like this. And by this time, we forgot that China is the most important trading partner of all our countries, of Australia, of the European Union, of the United States. So it's not that easy to say now we are on a confrontational course. And this is why I tend to believe that the Second Cold War is something that we can avert, and it is not. I mean, I'm not sure that it is the best intellectual framework to use at this point. Maybe I will be falsified in later years or later months, but I think if there would be a sliding into a Cold War, would be more a consequence of like emotions taking over logical steps in certain countries in the political domain. Okay, so in short, I doubt that the Second Cold War is coming, which is a good prospect.
Yeah, thank you.
Isn't it what is happening now, that emotion is taking over interest and?
Okay, so this is a slippery slope, obviously, because so if you believe in the rational choice, which I do, you don't quite believe in emotions taking over. But if you develop a political identity that is outright inimical to this or that country or this or that form of government, then you will end up taking decisions that are not for your benefit. I think this is sometimes quite visible, and you shouldn't necessarily talk about the United States. You can talk about the Czech Republic, because the Czech Republic, who have all these bombastic announcements that now there would be a whole new China politics, which does actually nothing to alter the real questions of the relations between the Czech Republic and this region, but they are generating a political tension, which may sound well in some quarters in Brussels and definitely in some quarters in Washington, but I doubt that there is hardly any Czech interest in it. So this is something, this is a course along which we may still slide into a Cold War. And obviously, it's not really something that is inherently Czech. This is something that is also, influenced by great powers.
Okay, thank you very much, Tomáš. I would like to give, because we have to wrap up this discussion. We only have 60 minutes, so I would like to give the floor to each of you for a few minutes to have your final thoughts. Yeah, maybe David, you could start with, and a little bit going back to AUKUS, yeah, because at the end, so we really broadened the picture.
We did talk about the big picture. I think AUKUS sits within the big picture in that it is a fairly traditional alignment of three traditional partners that have always worked closely together and have always been very similar in their strategic outlook. They're just in different locations. The prominence here of Australia in this case is, as I think Tomáš might have pointed out, I think that that Australia is actually in the region, and so AUKUS sounds like it's something new. It sounds like it's something new for Australia to have nuclear-propelled submarines. As I point out, I think essentially what's happening here is America's subcontracting a few of its submarines to Australia. Australia's basically subsidising an enlargement of the US nuclear fleet, and that's actually nothing too remarkable. What is remarkable about it is that Australia for so long was led by governments of both persuasions that were trying to balance both a deep integration with China and with the Asian region to build peace and prosperity in the Asian region, while also maintaining a strong security balance and keeping the United States in the Pacific. Has that now become unviable? And are we moving into a more emotional, values-based conflict and confrontation, or can we go back to some form of interests-based interdependence? These are the questions that we just don't know, because we're in a state of flux.
Thank you, David. Gergely?
I cannot say that I can see what the Chinese leaders are thinking, but I suppose that they look at AUKUS as something very anti-China. actually you cannot say that it has anything in it except for being anti-China. And this is a very bad message for the Chinese. I mean, China traditionally has a fear of being encircled, and I think AUKUS is raising its fears. It is about, or they at least they think that this is about the containment of China. This is about not letting China to get more space in the seas and in the Asia Pacific. So China got the message, and of course they will answer it in their ways. One is keeping on building their economic relations everywhere in the world where it is possible, and the other is getting into an arms race. You can see that, I mean, this year to build. We know that the Chinese Navy has been developing very fast. We know all these details of the Chinese military development. And I think AUKUS is not something that will make the Chinese stop their military development. It is something that will make them make it more rapid and strong, because the Chinese don't really have choice in this situation. They are forced to take part in this competition. They cannot do anything else now.
Okay, thank you very much, Gergely. Tamás, at the end?
At the end, okay, we always have this argument with Gergely about the new Cold War something. So maybe I draw an example, a distant example from the Cold War. So when there were Russian missiles deployed in Cuba, it didn't really alter the real security situation of the United States, but it had a very deep psychological impact. I think AUKUS is something like this. It doesn't really alter the situation in security terms, or at least not for the coming 20 years. But this might exercise a huge psychological impact on the whole region. From an American point of view, this is the long-awaited something big that they could announce. They are under pressure to come up with innovative ideas to counter Chinese influence and to show their allies that there is a willingness and there is an innovative inventory out of which they can use those ideas and put them into practice. And they are very good at putting something into practice. But maybe this idea raises more questions than actually answers. So it also was intended again to reassure allies that they are still on the lines and they still have those ideas. But again, there are serious allies like France and New Zealand to begin with, who may be even more disappointed than before. So I think it may have a huge psychological impact, but today, security-wise, it doesn't alter the picture, but it can have very serious political implications.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe 2 ideas at the end from my side. So I definitely agree with Tamás' approach at that point. So because of the deepness of the trade we have, it would be really difficult to imitate this Cold War. But the fact that we won't have this kind of, let's say, trade war in the real sense of the word, it doesn't mean that we cannot exclude the coexistence of different technological ecosystems, for example, which we are going into that direction. And it does not mean that we cannot trade. There's one idea. And the second one, so when counterbalancing AUKUS somehow, and you also mentioned Eurasia. The biggest part of Eurasia is occupied by Russia. So that's maybe the next topic. So we can discuss. So this Chinese and Russian friendship, or I don't know what is happening there, but still something happening. Yeah. So thank you very much for your insight, for the contribution. I hope that we can continue this on different platforms, this discussion. Thank you very much for today. Thank you.